He woke to pearlescent light and voices speaking in alien tongues. His body felt wrong, too light, too responsive after 30 years of stillness. The Zurans called him a marvel, but their caution spoke louder than their praise. What had happened aboard the Prometheus, and why did the Council fear what slept inside his mind? The walls glowed with a soft pearl-colored light that hummed like a low electrical current. He tried to sit up, but his body resisted like a rusted machine. A sharp ache spread through his limbs, a deep cellular fatigue that resisted all prior understanding of exhaustion. He flexed his fingers, expecting stiffness. They moved with unnatural precision. Too fluid, too perfect. 3 decades of cryostasis had left his muscles programmed in ways that felt both alien and familiar. Something deep in his nerves had been fundamentally rewired. Alien voices moved around him, crisp and efficient. They spoke a language of short, sharp tones that his mind began to decode, producing a broken stream of familiar words. One of them called him a marvel. Another cautioned against releasing the wrist constraints. They wore simple white garments, their skin pale gray with faint silver undertones. Their hands moved over glowing panels that floated in the air, adjusting readings he couldn't comprehend. He felt their gazes on him, not hostile but alert, like medics watching a contagious patient. His vitals flashed on a screen above the medbay cot. Heart rate 28 beats per minute, body temperature holding at 93 degrees, brainwave activity spiking in patterns that didn't match any known human baseline. Each new measurement drew quiet murmurs from the Zurans. They seemed equal parts fascinated and unnerved, their professional calm barely concealing deeper apprehension. He caught an exchange between 2 of them, hushed and tense. The neural pathways are rewiring themselves. His genome doesn't match the original scans. Every test revealed another irregularity. Muscles that shouldn't be capable of extreme flexion suddenly were. Reflex responses triggered not just from stimulus but from thought alone. They ran scans of his brain, and the monitors glitched, unable to capture the full spectrum of his cognitive output. They praised his resilience, his adaptability, but the words felt hollow, a polite cover for genuine alarm. They weren't afraid of what he was now. They were watching for what he might become. He realized then, the restraints weren't for his protection. They were a precaution. They feared what had been planted in his mind during those lost 30 years, some hidden knowledge that slept in him like a dormant code. He remembered the ship, the Prometheus, and the mission that had taken them beyond the edges of human exploration. What had they encountered out there, and what had it done to him? The questions started to surface, jagged and incomplete, and he knew the answers were already locked somewhere inside him, waiting. The Zuran scanning devices triggered vivid sensory flashbacks. He remembered the Prometheus mission clearly now. First contact. That deep, confident push into uncharted space. The crew's in-flight celebrations. The steady hum of the ship's engines. Then the quiet alarm from the sensor array. A wave of cold dread washed over the bridge. The anomaly appeared without warning. A silent, brilliant azure light suspended in the void. It didn't radiate or pulse like a star. It simply occupied space, defying known physics, not reflecting or emitting so much as existing within its own set of rules. The light held a strange, perfect stillness that felt more ominous than any cosmic storm. Ship systems screamed. Data streams flooded the core processing unit, information pouring in at impossible speeds. The flow wasn't one way. The light wasn't just transmitting. It was pulling. Human knowledge, engineering schematics, historical archives, biological data, streamed out of their computers and into the void. In return, a torrent of alien information flooded the system. Geometries that hurt to look at, languages made of pure mathematics, concepts with no earthly equivalent. The ship's interior started to warp for those who interfaced with the data. Walls flickered with impossible angles. The air shimmered with half-seen geometries. Crew members stationed at data terminals were the first to break. One officer began scribbling frantic equations on the viewport glass, her eyes wide and unseeing. Another repeated a single string of numbers over and over as his body began to tremor violently. They weren't just confused. Their minds were being structurally rewritten by information they couldn't contain. He remembered his post at the auxiliary comms panel, fighting to maintain a stable frequency, to send a distress signal that would never reach home. The entity's final transmission slammed into his mind not as sound but as a concept, a crushing weight of pure understanding. It wasn't a message of peace or war. It was an exchange, a forced transaction of consciousness. It took everything it wanted from their databanks and left its own immeasurable knowledge in return. Then, the blackout. The memory ended not with an explosion, but with a silent, overwhelming pressure like a deep ocean crush. He understood now. The Zurons weren't just studying his body's changes. They were monitoring the foreign knowledge embedded in his cells. A cognitive bomb that had already detonated once, rewriting his crew into insanity. The consequences of that encounter were permanent. He hadn't just survived an accident. He had become a container for something that broke reality itself. During a post-exam scrubdown, Asara shut the door seals and lowered the room's translation field. Her voice lost its clinical precision, becoming quieter. She spoke in staccato bursts, like someone used to speaking only when necessary. She told him the Zuran Council monitored all communication with Earth. They classified his survival as a volatile diplomatic issue. 5 years ago, a deep space patrol found the Prometheus adrift in a debris field. Earth's own tracking agencies still listed the ship as lost, unrecoverable. The Zurans never told them otherwise. The Council feared what Earth might do with the knowledge inside him. They saw humanity as ambitious, reckless, driven by a hunger for advancement at any cost. They'd read the mission logs from the Prometheus, watched the final recordings. They understood the entity's transmission wasn't just information, it was a transformative agent, a cognitive catalyst. His cryopod had been failing when they found it. Its power cell nearly drained, its stasis field flickering. They moved him to their own medical bay, studying the biological shifts as they happened. His body and mind were a live experiment in alien integration. Political factions within the Council argued constantly. The scientists pressed for deeper study, wanting to map the full extent of his changes. The security ministers pushed for containment, some even suggesting permanent isolation. His restricted movement in the medical wing wasn't just for his protection, it was a control measure. They needed to understand what he carried before deciding his fate. Or Earth's Asara's hands moved efficiently as she spoke, wiping down scanners, her focus on her task giving her words a detached, factual tone. She told him his existence was a liability. If Earth learned he'd survived and what he now contained, they would demand his return. They would attempt to replicate the entity's effects, weaponize the knowledge, and risk another catastrophic breach. The Zurans had seen this pattern before with other young species. Their caution came from experience, not prejudice. His presence threatened fragile interstellar treaties. Alliances with other species relied on strict protocols regarding first contact and technological exchange. A human, altered by an unknown cosmic force and carrying forbidden knowledge, represented a violation of those accords. He wasn't a patient. He was evidence of a dangerous, uncontrolled event. The Council's secrecy was a buffer, a way to manage a threat they didn't fully understand. He was too valuable to destroy, too dangerous to release, and too unstable to trust. His survival was a secret they intended to keep, for the safety of both their world and his. The truth settled in the room, cold and absolute. He was a prisoner of his own transformation. He stepped into the northern courtyard during a shift change when the perimeter screens flickered. 3 figures detached themselves from the long angular shadows near the eastern arch. Their skin was a deep aquatic blue, stretched tight over dense muscle. They didn't wear the pale uniforms of the Zurans. Their armor was darker, matte and segmented like insect carapace. They moved forward in a low, predatory crouch, their motions perfectly synchronized. No words. Their silence was more threatening than any challenge. Each held a weapon he hadn't seen before. Not energy rifles, but something more primal. Long, slender javelins with barbed tips that glowed with a faint internal light. The air around them hummed with a low-frequency vibration that made his teeth ache. He froze, assessing exits. The main gate was 30 paces behind him, but a quick glance confirmed its energy barrier was active, a shimmering wall of amber light. They had timed this. They had waited for the courtyard to be isolated. The lead hunter lunged. No warning. The movement was fluid and terrifyingly fast. He sidestepped, but the javelin wasn't aimed to kill. It grazed his shoulder and a searing electric pain shot down his arm. It wasn't just a cut. The weapon injected something, a nanite toxin or a neural disruptor. His vision blurred at the edges. His modified biology fought it, the alien alterations in his cells scrambling to neutralize the foreign agent. But the pain was immense, a white-hot fire in the joint. He stumbled back, gripping his arm. "I am not your enemy." The words came out ragged, desperate. He wasn't even sure they understood his language. Their faces remained impassive, carved from stone. They saw his altered human form not as a person, but as a specimen. A contamination risk, a breach in their world's biological sanctity. This wasn't a random attack. It was an extraction, or an extermination. The standoff laid bare the fractures in Zuran society. The Council's decision to keep him alive and hidden wasn't universal. These hunters, the Volca, represented a faction that saw all external influences as a disease. They believed in purity and isolation. Their orders likely came from high-ranking officials who opposed the Council's cautious study, who saw him not as a marvel, but as a mistake that needed erasing. He was a political problem they had decided to solve with violence. The second hunter raised his javelin, this time aiming for his chest. He braced, his body thrumming with adrenaline and the strange new energy coursing through him. Just as the hunter began his thrust, a brilliant azure light erupted between them. It wasn't a weapon's blast. It was a tear in the air itself, a silent, vertical slash of the same impossible blue as the entity from the Prometheus. The light didn't burn. It silenced. The humming javelin went dead in the hunter's hand. From the center of the light, a feminine figure materialized. She wasn't Zuran. Her form was taller, her skin held a faint luminescence, and she wore robes that seemed woven from shadow and starlight. She placed herself between him and the hunters, one hand extended. Her presence forced the Volca back a step, their coordinated confidence broken. She had intervened. But her arrival posed a new, more complex question. Who was she? And why did she protect him with the same energy that had destroyed his ship? Back in the medbay, Asara's hands moved over his injured shoulder with a focus that felt different from earlier exams. It was sharper, more urgent. She used a device that didn't match the standard-issue Zuran medical tools. It was older, its casing worn smooth by use, and it emitted a soft gold light that made his skin tingle where the Volca weapon had struck. She wasn't just treating the wound. She was scanning for something specific, her brow furrowed in concentration, her movements precise and deliberate. This wasn't in any protocol. She had intervened against the Volca. That act alone carried consequences. The Council maintained a fragile peace with the hunter clans. Attacking them, even in defense of a subject, broke agreements that were decades old. Her career, her standing, maybe her freedom, all were now at risk. She hadn't hesitated. Her actions spoke of a priority that overruled her orders, a personal stake that went beyond her duty as a medic. She saw him not as a subject, but as an asset. A necessary one. She spoke in a low voice, barely above a whisper as she worked. She told him of old Zuran texts, prophecies etched on stone tablets in forgotten caves. They spoke of star-touched beings, outsiders altered by forces from the void. These beings were not invaders. They were heralds. They arrived in times of great imbalance, destined to either save a world or witness its unraveling. The Council dismissed these as superstition, the relics of a less advanced time. But Asara's family were keepers. For generations they had preserved these old beliefs, guarding the knowledge that modern Zurans considered irrelevant. She believed his arrival, his transformation, wasn't an accident. It was an answer, a counterforce to a threat her people refused to acknowledge openly. There were things moving in the darker reaches of space, entities that fed on consciousness that sought to unravel the fabric of dimensional stability. The Council preferred to ignore them, to build higher walls. Her family's legacy was to watch for the signs and prepare for the convergence. She saw in him the potential to stand against that coming storm. His altered mind, his hybrid biology were not a curse. They were tools. He was the key she had been waiting for. When she finished the scan, she didn't immediately step back. She looked at him, and for the first time, her professional composure cracked. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, catching the light. It wasn't pity. It was the weight of a secret finally shared. The relief and terror of a gamble being placed. She had jeopardized everything on a belief, on an ancient text and a feeling in her gut. She wasn't just a medic following council mandates. She was a believer, and she had just committed herself to his survival no matter the cost. Her tear was a confession. She had chosen her side, and it was with him. A senior council member met him in a sterile debrief room. The Zurans didn't mince words. They told him Earth's fear was logical, almost inevitable. The knowledge inside him wasn't like learning a new language or studying alien engineering. It was interdimensional. It dealt with concepts that didn't fit within normal spacetime. Human science was built on predictable cause and effect. This was different. It was information that could rewrite physical laws in localized areas. It was inherently unstable, like trying to store a star in a glass jar. Humanity's drive for discovery was its greatest strength and its deepest flaw. Earth's authorities would see his transformation not as a warning, but as an opportunity. They would try to reverse engineer the process. They would attempt to weaponize it, to control it. The Prometheus logs showed their mindset clearly. The crew's first reaction to the entity wasn't retreat. It was intense scientific curiosity. They pushed for contact for data regardless of the risk. That hunger was still there, amplified by 30 years of technological advancement. The entity hadn't just given them data. It performed a kind of forced evolution. It altered biology on a fundamental level, rewriting DNA to act as a living storage device for truths the human mind wasn't designed to hold. This made him a walking testament to a new form of life, but also a contagion risk. His very cells could act as a vector, spreading the transformative effect. Earth safety protocols, its quarantine procedures, were built for known biological and radiological threats. They had no framework for something that could change the nature of reality itself. Stability across known space relied on careful boundaries. Multiple civilizations, including the Zurans, had treaties governing the exchange of certain technologies and knowledge. These agreements were born from past disasters, from societies that unraveled after accessing powers they couldn't control. His presence violated all of them. He was an uncontained, high-yield source of forbidden science. If Earth obtained him, it would trigger a galactic-scale security crisis. Other species would see it as an act of aggression, a move towards destabilizing the balance of power. His mind now held the potential for both immense progress and total collapse. He could, in theory, answer questions that had plagued scientists for centuries. He could also unintentionally trigger a chain reaction that would erase those scientists from existence. The Council saw this duality clearly. They understood the temptation he represented, and the catastrophic cost of giving in to it. Earth wouldn't see it that way. Their reports would classify him as contaminated. They would treat him as a specimen to be isolated and dissected, a biological hazard that needed neutralizing. His humanity would be secondary to the threat he posed. His transformation made him something other, something they would fear and seek to control or destroy. The very thing that made him unique in the universe was the same thing that would make him a target back home. The Council's secrecy was, in its own cold way, the only thing keeping him alive. They understood that sometimes the greatest danger wasn't the unknown. It was the familiar, desperate to make sense of it. Asara laid the weapons on a low stone table. They looked ancient. A simple recurve bow carved from a wood-like material that wasn't wood. Its string a sinewy silver filament. A spear with a bone-white shaft and a head of dark crystalline metal. They had no power cells, no glowing triggers, no obvious technology. But they hummed. A low, almost sub-audible vibration that made the air around them shimmer slightly. It was a sound you felt in your teeth, not your ears. She explained their function. They didn't fire projectiles in the conventional sense. They weren't designed to pierce armor or explode. Their entire structure was a resonance chamber, tuned to very specific energy frequencies. They emitted controlled vibrations that disrupted interdimensional energies, the kind that stabilized voidwalkers and their masters. The principles were what humans would call arcane, a science so advanced it appeared as magic or superstition. This wasn't about brute force. It was about precision. Modern Zuran energy weapons, plasma casters, particle beams, they were useless. They interacted with matter and energy within normal space. The Voidwalkers existed partly outside of that. Their forms were projections, anchors into this reality. Attacking them with conventional weapons was like trying to cut a shadow with a knife. It did nothing. The ancient tools worked on a different level. They targeted the connection point, the fragile tether holding the parasite in this dimension. Her ancestors created these after their own first disastrous encounter with similar entities generations ago. They weren't forged in weapons factories. They were crafted by scholars and philosophers who understood the fabric of reality in a way modern science had largely forgotten. They were tools of last resort built for one purpose: to sever unnatural connections, to close doors that shouldn't be open. They were instruments of balance, not war. There was a catch. They didn't work for just anyone. You couldn't simply pick one up and fire it. They required mental alignment. The user had to achieve a specific state of focus, a clarity of thought that resonated with the weapon's own frequency. It was a partnership. The weapon provided the power, but the user provided the intent, the targeting solution on a cognitive level. Without that alignment, they were just oddly vibrating pieces of old art. He watched her pick up the spear. Her grip wasn't a combat stance. It was meditative. Her breathing slowed. The hum of the weapon intensified, synchronizing with her. The crystalline tip began to glow with a soft internal blue light. She wasn't holding a weapon. She was conducting energy. She was a focal point. This was their only viable defense. Not to destroy the enemy, but to disrupt its hold on reality. To push it back into the void it came from. They were shields, not swords. Their entire strategy shifted in that moment, from fighting a war to restoring a broken equilibrium. Millar's explanation came in direct, unadorned sentences. She wasn't a council member giving a lecture. She was a soldier outlining a threat. The Voidwalkers weren't an invading army or a rival species. They were a cult. Their faith centered on the spaces between realities, the chaotic nothingness that separated stable dimensions. They believed this void was the true state of existence, a pure and perfect chaos. Ordered reality with its laws and logic was a prison. A mistake. A blasphemy. Their goal was to break the walls, to dissolve the boundaries. They didn't use ships or traditional weapons. Their method was parasitic. They sent out intelligences, entities of pure consciousness that sought out hosts on target worlds. They preferred minds already open to change. The ambitious, the desperate, the disillusioned. These intelligences would latch on, burrowing into the host's psyche, offering power and forbidden knowledge in exchange for control. The host became a vessel, a tool for the parasite to operate in our reality. Their original personality was slowly erased, replaced by a single-minded drive to serve the void. They hunted for specific things: knowledge that destabilized, technologies that blurred the lines between possible and impossible, data that, when fully understood, could unravel local reality. They wanted to collect these dangerous truths and use them as keys, to pick the locks on dimensional gateways. Each successful breach made the next one easier. Their attacks followed a pattern across multiple civilizations. They'd appear, quietly infest a population's fringe elements, and then start hunting for the most volatile information that society possessed. They weren't conquerors. They were saboteurs. They sought collapse, not control. Their core belief made them relentless. They saw the entity that struck the Prometheus not as an enemy, but as a kindred spirit, a force of pure, unrefined change. They believed its accidental transmission of knowledge to a human was a divine act, a seeding of chaos. His transformation was the beginning of a new, perfect breach. They wanted to complete the process, to find him, extract the stabilized knowledge from his mind, and use it to rip a permanent, uncontrolled gateway between their void and this reality. It would be an act of worship for them, the ultimate dissolution. His mind was their ultimate prize. He represented a unique fusion, a human consciousness, fundamentally altered by the void's energy, now containing a vast library of interdimensional knowledge that was, against all odds, stable. His very existence was an affront to their faith. He was proof that the chaos could be contained, understood, even mastered. He was a stabilized breach, a walking contradiction to their core doctrine. They wouldn't stop. They would throw every resource they had, sacrifice every host to claim what was inside his head. They needed him to finish what the entity started, to turn his mind into a weapon that would shatter the world. They saw him not as a person but as a key, and they were coming to turn it. The transport shuddered to a halt deep inside the mountain. The air smelled of cold stone and ozone. They stepped out into a cavern that shouldn't exist. The space was vast, the ceiling lost in shadow high above. The walls weren't rough rock. They were smooth, polished to a dark mirror finish and embedded with veins of crystal that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light. This wasn't a natural cave. It was a constructed space, ancient and precise. The air hummed with a low energy that felt different from the council's facilities. Older, deeper. Mellar stood waiting for them. She was an older Zuran woman, her skin like weathered granite, her eyes holding a sharp, amused intelligence. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a lifetime of discipline. She greeted them not with alarm, but with a dry, weary humor. "Took you long enough," she said, her voice a gravelly contrast to Asara's crisp tone. "The kettle's on. The Voidwalkers are not. Her joke landed flat, but the gravity behind it was absolute. This place had been her home, her fortress, and her prison for decades. She revealed her connection to Moore, the young Zuran guard who had occasionally brought him supplies. Her grandson. She was the real keeper of this place, the last in a long line of guardians. The refuge held artifacts her people had forgotten. Weapons that predated energy casters, data tablets etched on stone, not light, maps of star systems that no longer existed. It was a library of dead history and lost science, all preserved against the Council's deliberate forgetting. They curated knowledge, removing what they deemed too dangerous. She preserved it. The Voidwalkers had hunted this location for generations. They sensed the power here, the concentration of old truths. They had tried to breach its defenses countless times, sending infected hosts to scout the perimeter, to test its weaknesses. They never succeeded. The mountain itself was a shield. Its unique mineral composition and the ancient technology woven into the rock created a dead zone for conventional scans. The Council's sensors saw only solid stone. The Voidwalkers sensed a blank spot, a frustrating emptiness that drew them like a magnet. They knew something was hidden here. They just couldn't find the door. Here they were free from the Council's constant oversight, their political maneuvering and risk assessments. They could act. They could prepare. Melar's methods weren't approved. They were effective. This was where ancient Zuran practicality met the modern crisis head-on. No committees, no debates, just the raw tools and the raw problem. His transformed biology reacted to the environment. The crystalline veins in the walls called to something in his blood. His fingers tingled when he got near certain devices. A console covered in unfamiliar symbols lit up at his approach, its surface swirling with light patterns he somehow understood on an instinctual level. His mind, rewritten by the entity, recognized the older technology. It was built on principles closer to the interdimensional knowledge now locked inside him. The ancestral tools weren't foreign. They felt familiar. His altered state wasn't a liability here. It was a key. He could interface with systems the Zurans themselves could no longer fully operate. He was the missing component they needed to turn this refuge into a fortress. Melar placed the crystalline vessel on the stone table. The liquid inside was the color of a stormy sky at dusk, swirling with an internal light that cast shifting shadows on the walls. It wasn't water. It was heavier, thicker, moving with a purpose that defied gravity. She explained its origin in blunt terms. Her ancestors had synthesized it after their own catastrophic encounter with the entity's kind. It was made from elements harvested from the edge of a dimensional breach, a substance that existed in more than 3 states. It was the only tool they had that could possibly interact with the changes already happening inside him. Drinking it was a calculated risk with no middle ground. It would either lock the alien knowledge into stable, usable patterns within his mind and body, or it would complete the transformation the entity had started. It would finish rewriting him, stripping away the last of his human cognitive structure. Failure meant becoming a perfect vessel for the void, a being of pure chaos. He would become the very thing the hunters worshipped, a walking breach in reality. Success meant control. It meant being able to access the library in his head without being consumed by it. He would master the change instead of being its victim. The choice was stark. Remain as he was, an unstable container slowly being eroded by forces he couldn't understand, or gamble everything on a single swallow. He looked at Asara. Her face was tense, her hands clenched at her sides. She believed in the prophecy, in his potential, but she knew the cost. He looked at Melar. Her expression was grim acceptance. She had seen others try and fail. This was her last option and his. He picked up the vessel. It was cold, then warm, then cold again, cycling through temperatures that shouldn't be possible. The liquid moved against the glass as if trying to escape. He brought it to his lips. The smell was ozone and something else, a scent that had no earthly equivalent. It was the smell of empty space between stars. He drank. The effect was immediate and violent. It wasn't a poison. It was an awakening. A cold fire raced down his throat and spread through his veins. Every cell in his body lit up, screaming in recognition. His vision widened out, then slammed back into focus with a clarity that was painful. He could see the individual molecules in the air, the subtle energy fields connecting every object in the room. The equations carved into Melar's walls, once incomprehensible, now glowed with inherent meaning. They weren't math problems. They were statements of fact, as obvious as knowing that fire is hot. His hearing expanded. He could hear the hum of the planet's core, the faint whisper of solar wind against the atmosphere, the vibration of every living thing for miles. It was a symphony of data, overwhelming and perfect. His sense of touch became a dimensional map. He could feel the gravity well of the planet, the subtle pull of the moon, the press of distant stars. His mind, the human part, fought to hold on. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He focused on a single memory, his hand on the controls of the Prometheus. The feel of engineered plastic, the smell of recycled air, a human moment. He held onto it like an anchor in a hurricane. The alien knowledge surged, a tidal wave of understanding about quantum states and nonlinear time. But the anchor held. He was still there. He was still him. The patterns were stabilizing. The chaos was forming into structures he could navigate. His senses didn't settle. They exploded outward, reaching into layers of reality he hadn't known existed. He could see the world not as a solid object, but as a shimmering tapestry of energy and information. A web of interconnected points across multiple dimensions. He could see the anchors that held reality together. And he could see the things that were trying to pry them loose. The transformation was complete, but he had won. He had not lost himself. He had gained a new way to see. The gamble had paid off in perception. His new senses didn't just show him the room, they showed him the architecture of existence. Reality was no longer a solid thing. It was a shimmering web, a complex tapestry of intersecting energy lines and dimensional anchors. He could see the threads that bound matter together, the delicate points where one reality brushed against another. The stone walls glowed with a faint silver light, the ancient Zuran technology humming in harmony with the structure of space itself. He could track the flow of time like a visible current. He was no longer just in the world. He was of it, connected to its deepest workings. The Voidwalkers felt the shift. His integration sent out a psychic shockwave, a resonant frequency that rang through the dimensions they inhabited. They detected the stabilization of the knowledge they craved. It was a beacon. They converged on the mountain refuge not as scouts this time, but as a focused assault force. Their approach was a silent, coordinated wave of discordant energy. They didn't need to break down the door. They phased through the outer rock layers, their forms flickering in and out of solidity, bypassing physical barriers. Their energy signatures were a corrosive screech against his new perception. They moved like stains on the tapestry, blurring the clean lines of reality. Their presence disrupted everything they touched. The conventional defense systems Mellar had in place, motion sensors, energy dampeners, flickered and died as they passed. The devices were built for a world of simple cause and effect. The walkers operated outside those rules. They were a cognitive virus, and their mere proximity crashed systems that relied on logic. The ancient refuge responded differently. The crystalline veins in the walls flared with a brilliant, steady blue. The hum of the place deepened, becoming a resonant chord that pushed back against the invasive frequencies. Carved symbols on old consoles lit up, activating protocols that hadn't been used in centuries. This wasn't a technological defense. It was a dimensional one. The mountain itself became a tuning fork, its vibration countering the chaos of the void. It couldn't stop them, but it could slow them down, forcing them to expend energy to maintain their cohesion. He saw their weak points instantly. His expanded vision perceived them not as creatures, but as complex energy constructs. Each Voidwalker was a parasite latched onto a host body. The connection point was a tangled, frantic knot of unnatural energy, a desperate grip on a reality the parasite wasn't meant to inhabit. That knot was their Achilles heel. It was unstable, a wound in the fabric of the host's being. It was also the source of their power and their greatest vulnerability. He didn't need a weapon to understand how to fight. His mind, now aligned with the fundamental patterns of the universe, knew how to disrupt theirs. He could project a counter-frequency, a focused pulse of ordered energy aimed directly at those chaotic connection points. It wasn't an attack of force. It was an act of correction, like applying the right frequency to shatter a glass. He realized the transformation hadn't just given him knowledge. It had given him a defense mechanism. He was the shield. His stabilized consciousness could actively reject their dissonance, creating a zone of ordered reality around himself that they could not penetrate. He could protect not just himself but the space he occupied. The gamble had yielded a capability they hadn't anticipated, not just understanding the breach but being able to heal it. He hefted the spear. Its weight felt familiar now, an extension of his own aligned nervous system. His mind, stabilized and expanded by the transformation, didn't just hold the weapon. It communed with it. He focused, matching his own internal frequency to the low, constant hum resonating through the bone-white shaft. The crystalline tip began to glow, not with heat, but with a coherent blue light that sharpened the air around it. He wasn't aiming the spear. He was directing a precise beam of ordered energy, a corrective frequency designed for one purpose: to sever an unnatural connection. The first Voidwalker host convulsed as the energy struck. It wasn't a physical impact. The parasite, a tangled knot of interdimensional consciousness latched onto the Zuran's mind, fought back with pure dissonance. The host's body twisted, muscles locking and spasming as two forces warred for control inside it. Aiden held his focus. The process demanded absolute mental precision. Too much force would burn out the host's brain. Too little would let the parasite reinforce its grip. He had to find the exact resonant frequency that would unravel the knot without destroying the thread. He sensed the parasitic intelligence, a cold, frantic presence that felt nothing like a living mind. It was pure hunger, a will to consume and dissolve. It scraped against his consciousness, trying to disrupt his focus with waves of chaotic thought. Its connection to the spaces between dimensions made it resilient. It could draw power from the void, reinforcing its hold. It was like trying to cut a cable that was actively regenerating. He adjusted the frequency minutely, his altered perception allowing him to see the energy flows in real time, to find the weak points in the entity's chaotic structure. Asara provided cover. She stood her ground, the ancient bow in her hands. She drew the silver filament string, and an arrow of condensed light formed on the shelf. She didn't aim for kills. She fired at the floor near other advancing hosts, the arrows impacting with a concussive thrum of ordered energy. Each shot created a temporary zone of stability, a bubble of reality that forced the Voidwalkers to divert power to maintain their forms, slowing their advance. Her fire was suppression, giving him the precious seconds he needed to work. Millar coordinated from a console carved into the wall. Her hands moved over glowing runes, her voice a low, steady stream of information. She didn't shout orders. She recited data, energy readings, host vital signs, parasitic resonance fluctuations. She provided a tactical overlay, her ancient knowledge allowing her to predict the Voidwalker's movements to identify which host was the greatest immediate threat. The one on the left is weakening. Its tether is straining. Increase resonance by 0.05. Her guidance was clinical, precise, the product of a lifetime studying this exact threat. He pushed. The parasitic intelligence fought harder, a final, desperate surge of power that made the host's eyes bleed. Aiden tightened his mental grip on the spear, channeling a clean, sharp pulse of energy directly into the core of the knot. There was a silent internal snap. A wave of pure, null energy erupted from the host, harmless to matter but devastating to the parasite. The Voidwalker's form unraveled like smoke in a high wind. Its connection to the host severed completely. The parasitic intelligence screamed, a sound felt rather than heard, as it was ejected back into the void it came from. The host, a young Zuran male, collapsed to the stone floor, gasping. He was alive, disoriented, terrified, but free. The victory was clean. It wasn't destruction, it was liberation. Aiden looked from the freed host to the spear in his hand. This wasn't a weapon designed to kill. It was a tool for healing reality, for cutting out infections. The Council had feared him as a weapon. The Voidwalkers had sought him as a key. But in this moment he understood his true function. He was a protector, a shield. His power wasn't for breaking worlds, it was for keeping them whole. The fight was far from over, but its nature had just changed completely. Moore watched his movements after the fight. Her assessment was blunt. The integration was complete. It was also unstable. The Voidwalkers were scouts. The main force was still coming. They would adapt. They would learn from this failure. Their next attack would be smarter, more focused. They would not stop ever. His humanity was now a thin layer over something deeper. He still thought like a human, felt human emotions, but they were filtered through an alien lens. His anger had a mathematical precision. His fear came with tactical options. His memories of Earth felt distant, like watching a recording of someone else's life. His mind now operated on multiple levels at once, processing sensory data, energy frequencies, and dimensional anchors alongside his own thoughts. It was exhausting. It required constant focus to keep the parts separate, to prevent the overwhelming influx of information from drowning out the man he used to be. He carried a burden that could not be unloaded. The knowledge in his head wasn't just facts. It was a blueprint. With focus, he could design energy systems that defied conservation laws. He could map pathways to stars humans hadn't named. He understood biological principles that could extend a lifespan or rewrite a species. This was power that toppled civilizations. It was the kind of truth that started wars between stars. He was a living library of everything humanity wasn't ready to know. His body was a constant project. The transformation wasn't a one-time event. It was an ongoing process. His cellular structure required active maintenance to remain stable. Without focus, without the mental discipline to keep the alien patterns in check, his biology could start to unravel. He could lose coherence, his form becoming as unstable as the Voidwalkers he fought. This wasn't a passive state. It was a choice he had to make every second. To remain solid, to remain himself, Earth was lost to him. They would never understand. Their scientists would see a specimen. Their military would see a weapon. Their politicians would see a threat. They would try to contain him, to study him, to take apart the miracle to see how it worked. They would not see a person. They would see the Prometheus incident repeating itself, and their solution would be a tighter box and more stringent controls. Going back was not an option. Home was a memory. The Council's fear was now clear. They didn't just fear the knowledge he carried. They feared what he could become. A free agent with his capabilities, answered to no government, obeyed no law. He could start his own civilization, found his own religion, rewrite physics on a planetary scale. They wanted him contained because a single man with that much power was a geopolitical nightmare. He was a variable their careful equations could not account for. His personal survival was no longer a private matter. It was a point of tension in a much larger game. Factions within the Zuran Council, the Volca hunters, the Voidwalkers, even other unseen species, all had a stake in what happened to him. His continued existence was a form of manipulation on a galactic scale. Every breath he took influenced alliances and conflicts he knew nothing about. He was a piece on a board he couldn't see. He had paid for this future with his past. The man who woke up on the Prometheus was gone. His old life, his old wants, his old fears, they were artifacts. Useful reference points, but no longer his driving force. The cost was total. He had traded a single human existence for a role in a much larger story. The burden was permanent. There would be no retirement, no quiet life on a farm. His vigil was eternal. The Voidwalkers would keep coming. New threats would emerge, drawn to the signal of his unique existence. His life was now a continuous state of defense. He had gained incredible power, but the price was a lifetime of war. He accepted it. The alternative was becoming the very thing he was fighting. They packed what they could carry: weapons, medical supplies, dried rations that wouldn't spoil. The mountain refuge was a fortress, but it was also a known location. The Voidwalkers had found them once. They would find them again. The ancient defenses were powerful, but they were finite. Each attack weakened the structural harmonics of the place. They couldn't risk being cornered. They needed mobility. They needed to disappear. Their new mission required space. Real distance. They needed to operate outside the Council's territorial claims, beyond the reach of their patrols and their political oversight. The Council's protection was a cage. Their rules, their bureaucracy, their constant assessment. It all slowed response time. It created vulnerabilities. The Voidwalkers didn't file reports or wait for committee approval. They acted. To fight them, they had to be just as fluid, just as unbound. The Southern Hemisphere offered that isolation. Its territories were older, less developed. The land was rugged, carved by ancient glaciers and seismic shifts. The Zuran settlements there were sparse, cloistered in deep valleys. The people were different. They held to the old ways. The traditions the Northern Council labeled superstition. They remembered the stories. They understood the threats that came from beyond the stars. Here, they wouldn't be seen as fugitives or anomalies. They might find allies, or at least they would be left alone. This was where they could finish his training. His transformation was stable, but it was raw. His control was instinctual, not mastered. He needed to learn to focus his new senses, to harness the flow of information without being overwhelmed by it. The southern wilds provided a clean slate, free from the constant energy noise of Zuran cities and technology. He could learn to listen to the planet itself, to understand his connection to the deeper patterns of reality. It was the only place he could become what he needed to be. They had to prepare for the long game. The Voidwalkers would adapt. Their next assault wouldn't be a frontal attack. It would be subtler: infiltration, psychological warfare. They would target supply lines, sabotage communications, turn potential allies against them. The team needed a secure base where they could stockpile resources, develop new tactics, and plan counter-operations without looking over their shoulders. They needed a home, not just a hideout. The decision was a calculated rejection of safety. Staying in the north meant relative security under the Council's watch, but it also meant limitations. It meant working with gloves on. Moving south was a gamble. It meant harsh conditions, unknown dangers, and total self-reliance. But it also meant freedom. The freedom to act, to innovate, to make the hard choices without filing a request. The work they had to do couldn't be contained within institutional borders. It demanded they step outside them. They loaded the last crate into the ground transport. The vehicle was old, its engine modified to emit a low electromagnetic signature. It wouldn't show up on most scans. Malar closed the hatch, her movements final. This was a permanent shift. They weren't coming back. The northern refuge had served its purpose. Now they needed a new kind of stronghold, one built not just on ancient stone but on complete autonomy. They chose the uncertainty of the wild over the false security of a system that couldn't handle the truth. Their path led away from everything known, into the stark, open silence of the south. Asara stood by the southern transport, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the rocky plains. She didn't look at him when she spoke. Her voice was low, stripped of its medical precision. "There is no office for what we do now," she said. "No department. No chain of command. We answer to the problem. Nothing else." The words hung in the cool air, a statement of fact that carried the weight of exile. They were operating in the gaps now, between the Council's jurisdiction and the wild territories, between established scientific understanding and the raw, unstable truths of the cosmos. Their path wouldn't follow maps or regulations. It would cut across ethical boundaries and political borders. They would have to make choices that would horrify their former superiors. Steal resources, bypass safeguards, hide breakthroughs that could benefit millions because revealing them risked attracting the wrong kind of attention. The greater good demanded they work in shadows. Their mission was singular: guard the connection, the fragile, invisible alliance between stable realities and the minds that could perceive them. They weren't soldiers protecting a border. They were surgeons performing delicate operations on the fabric of existence itself. Each Voidwalker expelled, each breach stabilized, was a silent victory no one would ever record. Their success meant normal life continued uninterrupted for billions, who would never know how close it came to unraveling. This meant rejecting conventional authority. The Council's rules were designed for known threats. Their procedures moved too slowly, their caution creating windows for disaster. The Voidwalkers didn't care about protocols. They exploited hesitation. To fight them, the team had to be willing to act first, to make decisions in seconds that would take a committee weeks to debate. They became their own command structure, their authority coming from necessity, not permission. They blended tools from different eras. Malar's ancient wisdom provided the framework, the deep understanding of the enemy's nature. Asara's medical and scientific knowledge offered modern context, a way to apply that wisdom to current threats. His transformed mind was the bridge, the processor that could link ancient principles to contemporary problems. They weren't just using old weapons. They were creating a new discipline, a fusion of past and present built for a future no one else saw coming. They stopped being reactive, waiting for attacks, responding to breaches. They started thinking like architects. They began planning how to reinforce reality's weak points, how to create early warning systems tuned to interdimensional frequencies, how to build a network of stability that could withstand the constant pressure from the void. They shifted from being victims of a cosmic change to being its stewards. They were building the defenses for the next 1,000 years. She turned to him finally, her expression grim. "We walk the void and remain ourselves." It was a simple statement, a creed. It meant moving through chaos and uncertainty without losing their core, without letting the darkness change them into something cruel or indifferent. It was a promise to fight for order without becoming tyrants, to wield incredible power without being corrupted by it. Their greatest weapon wasn't the spear or the bow. It was their humanity, however altered, holding fast against the storm. This became their guiding principle, a reminder that the mission wasn't just about survival. It was about identity. They could navigate the spaces between dimensions, understand forces that broke lesser minds, and still choose to protect those who would never understand them. The challenges ahead were immense, but they had a compass now. A simple, unwavering truth to hold on to when the path ahead faded into the unknown. They would walk the void, and they would remain. Aiden stood on a high ridge watching the dual moons rise over the southern desert. His perception had settled. The initial overwhelming flood of data had receded, leaving a clear, steady stream of awareness. He saw reality as a complex structure, dimensional layers meshing like interlocking gears. He could focus on a single point and trace its connections across the cosmos, feeling the subtle pull of gravitational fields and energy currents that bound everything together. This was his new normal. The chaos had been tamed into a usable tool. His human emotions were still there, but they passed through a different filter. Grief for his lost crew was a quiet, precise ache, analyzed by a mind that understood the physics of memory and the chemical nature of sorrow. Anger at his situation came with a tactical readout of options and consequences. His feelings were no longer simple reactions. They were inputs for a more complex processing system. He felt everything, but he experienced it from a slight distance, like an operator monitoring his own vital signs. He understood the fear on both sides now. He saw Earth's perspective with perfect clarity. Their caution was rational. An altered human carrying unstable cosmic knowledge was a containment nightmare. Their protocols were designed to prevent another Prometheus event, to protect their people from truths that broke minds. He also understood the Zurons, their political maneuvering, their secrecy. It was a defense mechanism. They'd seen other species self-destruct after accessing power too quickly. Their rules were scars from old wounds. His role was changing. He wasn't just a survivor trying to stay alive. He wasn't a weapon to be controlled. He was becoming an intermediary, a translator. He could speak the language of human ambition and Zuran caution. He could see the middle path, the way to use the knowledge without unleashing it. He held the potential to build a bridge between two worlds that saw each other as threats. His expanded understanding erased old boundaries. He saw that the most advanced Zuran energy theories shared a common root with the principles behind Earth's simplest art. A masterfully composed symphony and a perfectly balanced equation resonated on the same frequency. They were different expressions of the same underlying order. Creation and discovery were not separate paths. They were the same journey. This helped him grasp smaller things, too. He finally understood why Lyran youth were so drawn to Earth's culture exports. Their music, their primitive video games, their fashion. It wasn't about the quality. It was about the raw, unfiltered creativity. Earth's art was chaotic, emotional, and beautifully imperfect. It represented a freedom of expression that more advanced, controlled societies had lost. It was a glimpse into a mindset the Zurans had engineered out of themselves. His knowledge wasn't just a threat. It was a potential unifier. He could show the Zurans the value in human imperfection. He could show Earth the wisdom in Zuran caution. He possessed the keys to a deeper cultural exchange, one based on mutual respect for different approaches to existence. He could demonstrate that survival wasn't about choosing one way over another. It was about finding the balance. He made a quiet decision standing there under the alien moons. He would not be a weapon for either side. He would be the bridge. He would use his transformation not to conquer or destroy, but to connect, to build understanding where there was only fear. The waking world, with all its dangers and complexities, was far stranger than any dream he'd ever had, but it was real, and he had a place in it, a purpose, not to fight the chaos but to navigate it. They patched wounds under a sky of unfamiliar stars. Their team was an accident, a forced arrangement, a human who wasn't fully human anymore, a Zuran medic who'd betrayed her orders, an ancient keeper most of her people thought was a myth. They had nothing in common but the threat. The Voidwalkers didn't care about their backgrounds. They just wanted them all dead. Asara moved between two worlds. Her medical training was a product of Zuran science, all precision and protocol. Her belief in him, in the prophecies, was an act of faith passed down through her family for generations. She balanced the two. She used her scanner to check his vitals while trusting a centuries-old text to guide their next move. Her professional duty told her to report his every change to the Council. Her personal conviction told her to hide them. The conflict was a constant tension in her, a tightness around her eyes when she thought no one was looking. Milar offered wisdom, but it came with a price. Respect. Her knowledge wasn't a gift. It was a loan, and she expected payment in the form of absolute attention to her methods. She dismissed modern Zuran technology as clumsy, their tactics as naive. She demanded they learn the old ways, the rhythms and rituals that had kept the darkness at bay long before energy shields and plasma rifles. She tolerated their questions, but her patience was thin. She had seen too many arrogant youngsters ignore the past and pay for it. Her cooperation was conditional on their willingness to listen. He was the wild card. His human perspective was still there, but it was filtered through an alien lens. He thought in terms of Earth logic, of cause and effect, but his mind now processed data on a scale that defied that logic. He could see the patterns in Milar's ancient stories. He could understand the science behind Asara's medicine. He acted as a translator between the two worldviews, finding the common ground between hard data and intuition. His altered state made him the bridge they needed to function. Their differences were vast. Asara valued clean, sterile environments. Milar trusted the grit of the earth and the hum of natural stone. He was used to human improvisation, to making do with what was at hand. They clashed over tactics, over resource allocation, over the interpretation of a single line from an old text. The friction was constant, a low-grade annoyance that flared under stress. Shared purpose overrode pride. When the Voidwalkers attacked, their arguments vanished. Asara's medical skills stabilized them. Milar's knowledge identified the enemy's weaknesses. His transformed abilities provided the force to exploit them. They fell into roles without discussion, a seamless unit born from necessity. Trust wasn't built on conversation. It was forged in the heat of combat, in the silent understanding that each person's survival depended on the others doing their part. They began to learn each other's rhythms. Asara started preparing a clean field for Milar's artifacts without being asked. Milar began explaining the reasons behind her commands instead of just giving them. He learned to anticipate their needs, using his expanded awareness to warn them of threats before their own senses could detect them. The alliance stopped being a temporary arrangement. It became a system, a machine with three very different parts that somehow worked. The bond was unexpected. It wasn't friendship in any normal sense. It was deeper. It was the trust of people who have looked into the void together and decided to face it as one. Their backgrounds didn't matter. Their titles were irrelevant. They were simply three beings who had chosen to stand between the darkness and the light. The existential threat had stripped away everything but the core of who they were, and in that stark reality, they found they fit together perfectly. The alliance, forced by circumstance, had become their greatest strength. It was stronger than any one of them alone. He watched the twin moons set, their light fading from the rocky plains. Acceptance wasn't a decision. It was a quiet settling, like dust after an explosion. The Prometheus hadn't just been a ship. It was his old life. That version of himself was gone, dismantled and reassembled by forces he still didn't fully understand. The disaster wasn't something that happened to him. It was something that remade him. He was a different kind of being now. The knowledge in his head was a permanent weight. It wasn't a book he could close. It was a current flowing through his mind, a constant hum of information that demanded his attention. This was an eternal responsibility. Every thought, every action had to be measured against the potential consequences. A stray idea, fully formed, could theoretically rewrite local physics. A moment of lost focus could let the alien patterns in his cells destabilize. His existence was now a continuous act of maintenance. He was the warden of his own mind. He would never be just human again. His biology had crossed a line. His cells operated on principles that defied Earth science. His thought processes integrated data from multiple sensory layers simultaneously. Human emotions felt familiar but distant, like listening to a conversation through a thick wall. He remembered what it felt like to be normal, but the memory had no emotional texture. It was a historical fact about someone else. Earth was a complicated idea. It was home, but it was also a threat. The people there would see a monster, a contaminated specimen. Their fear would be rational. Their solution would be a containment cell, and a team of scientists trying to reverse engineer the process that created him. They wouldn't see a person. They would see the Prometheus incident waiting to happen again. Returning would endanger everyone. The Zurans were not saviors. Their protection came with strings. The Council saw him as a volatile asset, a political tool to be managed and controlled. Their hospitality was a form of custody. They offered safety, but it was the safety of a specimen jar. They wanted to study the phenomenon without being changed by it. Their manipulation was a quieter danger than Earth's fear, but just as effective a cage. His mind was a fortress that required constant guard. The Void Walkers were a permanent threat. They would never stop hunting him. Their parasitic intelligences sensed the stabilized knowledge within him like a beacon. They would adapt their tactics, learn from each failure, and return with greater numbers and sharper strategies. His survival was not a one-time event. It was a condition of his existence. Vigilance was his new heartbeat. He made his choice. He would not seek a return to normalcy. That path was closed. He chose the burden. He chose the fight. He would use this transformation, this unwanted gift, to protect others from the same fate. He would stand with Asara and Melar in the shadows and do the work no one else could or would do. The cost was his past, his identity, his chance at a simple life. The man he was died aboard the Prometheus. In his place was a guardian, a shield against forces that sought to unravel reality itself. He lost everything he had been. In return, he found a purpose that mattered more than a single life. The trade was brutal, but it was honest. He was no longer a victim of circumstance. He was a soldier in a war no one else could see. And he would not step down. The waking world demands a sharp price for its truths. Aiden paid with his past, his very humanity, to guard realities he never knew existed. His sacrifice opened a door, one humanity may yet walk through. Not as conquerors, but as participants on a vaster cosmic stage. The knowledge carried in one man's mind could have shattered worlds. Instead, it became a shield. Some understanding comes at a terminal cost. It protects everyone by demanding everything from a single soul. The peril is endless, but so is the purpose found in standing against it.